covered some similar territory and some different territory across the South, looking for stories about just plants and the people that take care of them. And you covered even feral hogs in a graphic way.
Yes.
I guess I would say, this is a book that is very well written, densely packed with information. A lot of surprises. It's a travelogue. It's fun from that perspective. But what caught my eye at first was learning that John Muir had traveled the South. And so I'm just curious, Dan, we could probably start with just hearing about how you came to the idea of doing this book.
Sure. First off, thank you, Georgann. It's a pleasure. It's a treat to be here with you, and I appreciate you taking the time. And the good folks at Malaprops, thank you. You're one of my favorite, and I'm not just saying this, one of my favorite bookstores in the country. And just quickly, I've been coming here since the late 80s, and Asheville's gone through a lot of ups and downs, but Malaprops has always been there, and I'm a big fan. Anyways, how did I come across Muir? As you and they said, I was a reporter for many years. I'd covered a lot of these issues about the environment, coal ash would climate change, water wars, endangered species, you name it, all these sort of disparate environmental issues. And, I would always do one-offs in the newspaper. I'd write maybe a 40, 50-inch story and, put it in there and hope people would read it. But I was always looking for a way to stitch all these disparate, important, as I think they are, environmental issues together, and largely environmental issues of environmental degradation and the problems that are rife here in the South. So I was always looking for a way the last 10 years or so to make sort of a cohesive argument, to tell a cohesive story about the South, its beauty and biodiversity, but also its challenges. So I probably, like a lot of you, knew John Muir, as, the guy out west, the father of the national parks, perhaps even the father of the American environmental movement. But I did not know that he had traveled the South, that before he became John of the Mountains and John of the Sierra, as a young man still, he walked the South and wrote about it in a book called A 1,000-Mile Trek to the Gulf. So when I was Googling around for, I don't know what, maybe John Muir, I saw that and I go, wow, he walked the South. I want to see if I have been to some of the places that he had been to. So I got the book, and there's a lovely map that I was able to trace his route and go, like, yeah, I've been there. I wrote about that there, and I've been there, and I wrote about that there. So I took his map and I penciled in his route, and then a lot of the issues that I had written about, I plotted on the map there, and there was a lot of overlay. So from that, I'm figured this is probably a pretty cool way, I think, to tell the story of the South and the environmental issues of the day, both what he saw back then and currently the issues, the problems we have today. So that's more or less how I came to Muir and how he helped me coalesce and bring all my thoughts together in like one nice package.
Did you know what an unappealing person he was when you started?
I was not, and I still am not a Muir expert. This is not a biography of Muir. I knew him just solely as, again, John of the Mountains, sort of the sage of the West, the godfather of the American environmental movement. And all of those things I thought obviously were pretty cool. Who doesn't love national parks? But as you rightly point out, as I got into, and of course I did a ton of research on who he was and what he wrote, and I read a bunch and everything, even in his 1,000-mile trek to the Gulf, it becomes quickly apparent that John Muir was a racist. And this was shocking, obviously, to me. And I'm sort of assuming your next question, did it keep me from, did I think that maybe I should not be writing about him, or does it diminish what he has accomplished? And would I be, morally okay to write a book which, based largely on John Muir? And so I put down my pen and I, for a good 3 or 4 days, I sat there and I weighed, can I, in good conscience, write about these things I want to write about, but using John Muir as a device? And obviously I came up and said, yes, I can. But a couple of things. One, I was not going to dodge the issue. I mean, I think, as I said right now, I come straight out and say he's a racist. And I do
You
not.
called him a Bible-toting prude.
Well, I call him a lot of things, but I felt a need to explain, and I still feel a need to explain why. I obviously his racism and his nastiness towards African Americans and Native Americans cannot be excused. A lot of people said it was, well, that was the times. You know, that's what all people in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and frankly, a lot of the leaders of the environmental movement at the time, from Audubon all the way down, were similarly racist. But my thinking was that, okay, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I'm going to tell it like it is. And it does indeed diminish, in my eyes, John Muir as a man, as the leader of a movement. But what I finally settled on is I don't think that it necessarily diminishes what he hath wrought. And if you can absent the man from, you know, this incredible environmental movement, which he helped engender, for me, that's how I was able to, perhaps rightly, perhaps wrongly, I don't know, y'all make that decision, but how I was able to reconcile and continue on.
I guess I was surprised as I started reading that you kind of dispatched with Muir pretty quickly. You told us his whole life story in a chapter, and then moved on with your story and wove bits of him back in, which ultimately I felt was really effective. I think it works. John Muir dies like in the second or third chapter, right? We find out how he dies.
We get rid of him quick.
He just
I was sick of him.
But he, I didn't even know that he made this trip until I was on book tour in Fernandina with my book and found out that John Muir had been there and had crossed Florida and ended up with malaria and almost died in Cedar Key, which is really interesting. So lucky you to have found this thread to pull.
Well, and again, it's a journalistic device, and I used him to, if I could have written the book, I think you'd ask me earlier, could I have written the book without him? Sure. Does it make it a better book with him? Yes. Does it provide me a device, a literary device, as it were, to tell his story? Absolutely. By following his path, I follow his path, and I write about what I see the issues are there. But I also go back, as you pointed out, and I include a lot of his writings on, from 1867 on what he saw, juxtaposed with what I saw. So again, it's a device which kind of helps me tell and move along the story.
Well, I really part of my favorite part of writing Saving the Wild South was discovering the botanists that traveled the South and documented so many plants and mostly plants. I was studying botanists, and they were fascinating characters. They were some of the greatest joy. And I began to understand that botanists are a little, they're hoarders or collectors. But I met a fellow at Auburn who said, yeah, I'm in charge of the Arboretum at Auburn, and I get to take care of all these plants, and it really helps me manage my hoarding tendencies. And, there were some guys in Florida who rode trains and would watch out the window for plants. And when the train stopped, they'd get out and walk back and collect the specimens, which was really amazing.
That's a good way, and you know this better than me, better than anybody, but just the incredible biodiversity in the South. I go into a lot, that she does also, on the biodiversity and the beauty of the South. So it's not all negative. My father-in-law's accused me of being like Debbie Downer with my book, because I raised a lot of, coal ash, water resource depletion, climate change, for crying out loud. It's depressing. But yes, it is, but it's instructive. But also I'm a lover of the South and of its beauty. And so a couple of statistics kind of always jump to my mind here when I'm talking about the South and its spot. We live outside of Hawaii, the most biodiverse region in the country. 90% of the country's birds either live here or fly through here. 2/3 of the fish live here in the South. 1/3 of the world's freshwater mussels are in the South. And then my favorite, the salamanders. I don't know if you all like salamanders. I love salamanders. We have more salamanders here than anywhere in the world. Now, a lot of these things, you don't see unless you hang out in the stream or you hang out on a mountaintop or whatnot. But just to know that we have them here on top of, and I'm preaching to the choir here, Western North Carolina, you can be on top of a 6,500 mountain bald, in the morning. In the afternoon, you can be down in the marshes of the coast, South Carolina, not North Carolina, or Georgia, 4 or 5 hours later. That sort of biodiversity, the different ecosystems, the different regions that you pass through along the way is unsurpassed anywhere in the country. So I think that's something that most people don't know. And I think it's something that definitely I wanted people to know.
Well, as Southerners, we care about plants. We grow plants. We have great environments to grow plants. And we talk about the weather a lot. And now everybody's talking about the weather, right? And you do that beautifully in a lot of chapters, but maybe we could talk about any number of things, but I had just been to Gatlinburg for the first time since I was a kid when I read your chapter and did the traffic jam in Cades Cove. You all have been to Cades Cove maybe, and if you time yourself poorly, you end up stop and go. Yeah, talk about feeling guilty about climate change. We were all running our motors in this beautiful, pristine environment, and people would stop to see a bear, and there you were stuck.
Right.
It took us forever to get through.
Well, and I have, Muir passed only through a corner of Western North Carolina, just from Coker Creek, Tennessee, if y'all know where that is, up on the border. And then down, he went through Murphy and then on down to Blairsville, Georgia. So he was only in a little corner there. That didn't stop me, though, from having a good 2 or 3 chapters that I set in North Carolina, and the mountains in particular, just because I happen to love the Western North Carolina mountains. But the one that you referenced in Gatlinburg, I don't know, I'm sure you all remember the terrible fires that were there in 2016, I believe. So there's a couple of lessons that I hope to have imparted in the chapter on Gatlinburg. One is just how crazily, and y'all here in Nashville, I'm preaching to the choir, development, sprawl, what have you. It's not just an Atlanta thing, obviously. It's not just a Charlotte thing. It's here, and it's in the mountains and the coves and the valleys and the hills and everything. And a stat I have in the book here is that the Western North Carolina mountains are due to add another 6 Asheville's population, which is what, 70, 80,000, something like that, of people in the next 50 years through the mountains. So that gives you an idea of what we're up against, and why in Gatlinburg, which was what was so tragic about it, is it was just a hellacious, quick 90-mile-an-hour storm that came through there and just scattered all of the embers all through town. A number of people died, but it would not have been as bad if people didn't decide to put little cabins, or whatever they call them there, on all of the ridges around town. So many of those burned. And that's a problem that's known as WUI, wildland urban interface. Everybody wants to get out as close as they can to that beautiful view up on the mountains, or down in the valley or whatnot. So we all want our 2 or our 5 acre plot of land. By doing that, we are just extending ourselves and lessening the environmental beauty of the region. More and more of that is coming, and it's going to be dangerous, especially during fire season. So that I think is an important message. That, and during the research, I didn't realize how extensive it was.
And they rebuilt.
And of course, I went back, a couple of years later. I was actually 2 weeks earlier, I was reporting there was another fire down in North Carolina over near Franklin, the North Carolina-Georgia border. And it was a bad little fire, but nobody died. Then 2 weeks later was that one. And then so when I went up to Gatlinburg a couple of years after the fire, everything's rebuilt. It's probably added on to since then. And we will yet again, there will be more droughts. We've had a lovely rainy summer, but there will come a time every 10 years or so where we have bad droughts and the rivers dry up and the creeks dry up and it gets hot and we get lightning or we get kids with matches. And I'll get off my soapbox.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the avens, the
Mhm.
endangered plant that you covered in North Carolina, because I thought that was really fascinating. So you were in the amphibolite section
Right.
of the mountains of North Carolina. I have a friend who processes maple syrup up there,
Oh,
and
cool.
his trees, the maple trees, he declares are sweeter because of the presence of this mineral called amphibolite. The rhododendron don't grow there because they need an acid soil, and this is a different pH.
Mhm.
And so he claims that his maple trees are super sweet, and his maple syrup is wonderful.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
Cool.
So anyway, but you also discovered some folks taking care of a plant that's grossly endangered.
One of the things not necessarily a first goal of my book, but one I think that's important is I try and shine a spotlight on the unsung heroes in the environmental, ecological conservation movement. And my day job, I work for, with biologists with the Department of Interior all the time and tell their stories. And so I apply that also to the people that I interview in the book. And there's a fellow named Chris Ulrey, who I was hoping to come be here today. Hi, Chris. And he's one of my heroes. He's a biologist or ecologist? Ecologist with Park Service. And he has a number of things, but one of the things he's done now for 20 years is to track the progress, and correct me if I'm wrong, of a beautiful yellow flower called the spreading avens. I'd never heard of it. I'd never heard of Chris, but when I did learn, and Fish and Wildlife has some sort of role in this too, that it is a very endangered flower that only lives at around 4,000, 4,500 feet and further up on north or northwest facing rock cliffs, and that it is trying to escape the ravages of climate change, i.e. warmer weather, and by moving further up the mountain to get to cooler climes. I just thought that was cool. A plant that is physically moving to get to survive. And so I called up Chris, and he was generous enough to invite me along to spend the day with him and his Spreading Avens crew, cataloging. Every year for 20 years, there's 20 sites, I believe, that he visits to check the progress. Are there more of them? Are there fewer of them? Are they having more flowers, more stems, more seeds, what have you? And so we went and visited a site, and I cannot tell you, Chris swore me to secrecy, but it's somewhere near Boone. And it's on private land, I believe the site was. And so he goes out, and we went out for one day, and we trekked up through the mountains on all these deer trail and whatnot. And we got to this really crazy ridge, and he and two others, including a 14-year-old girl, rappelled down the ridge to count the individual spreading avens flowers. And I thought it was really cool, except I couldn't see it because it was in the fog. So I had to take his word for it that he actually saw some of these things. But finally the fog lifted, and there he was rappelling down this thing, counting these little flowers and yelling up to the biologist next to me the numbers and what had changed and everything. So I think that sort of work, obviously it's super important. We need to know what's happening to these things. But also I think, a question that I know you have also tussled with is, why does it matter? Why should we care? And I asked Chris this about a flower that's probably going to blink out when it has nowhere else to go. Why do we care? You'll never see it unless you get an invite with Chris to go traipsing through the middle of nowhere and climbing rocks over to see these things. It means nothing to you, right? Why should we care? So why should we care?
There you go.
I mean, we could ask Chris, but since I've got a book about it, let me read it.
That's for
Okay, yeah. Let me start off with, this is what I wrote. Why will mankind really suffer without a near extinct flower that most people have never heard of? This is Chris. I knew you were going to ask that. Why should we care? Chris admits, laughing. I don't know. I never feel like I have a great answer. Eventually, though, he comes up with one. Quote, I feel like this is an indicator of the whole ecosystem we live in, Chris says. It's like the canary in the coal mine. If we ignore this, then what's next? In ecology, everything is connected. The more things we take out of the web of life, the more likelihood that the whole thing collapses. And philosophically, ethically, don't we have a responsibility to take care of these species? Yes. Virginia, this is the 14-year-old girl, amazing, Virginia listens quietly to our mountaintop conversation, but the girl who first started rappelling for Avens at age 13 and was recently named the Park Service Volunteer of the Year could remain silent no longer. Quote, a lot of people have the opinion that they'll only fix stuff if it affects their life, Virginia says, her voice rising. But that thinking is just horrible. How selfless. I just personally wish we could do something to save these species, especially if it's us that's killing them in the first place. So between Chris and Virginia, I ask this question all the time, and those guys nailed it. Why we should care.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about water resources. Boy, the rivers. I was sort of sickened by the Savannah River story and Tybee Island, and of course, in my book, there are some endangered plants very close to the Savannah River in South Carolina,
oh, cool.
right across the way. So I was familiar, and that, of course, is where Bartram was hanging out.
Yep.
So
the Savannah River, it's kind of a common story, The northern reach of the Savannah has all been dammed, and when you dam a river, you, in essence, not kill it, but the biodiversity within it. The sturgeon can't get upriver to breed and to lay their eggs. All sorts of, it changes the flow of the river, changes the sediment composition of the river. So all sorts of bad things happens when you do that. The lower third of the river, from Tybee on up to Savannah and a little bit beyond, is largely ruined because of the deepening and the dredging of the river to let those really big container ships come up the river. If you deepen, you allow more salt water to come further upriver. When you do that, the critters, the mussels, the fish, other species that depend upon this sort of cocktail of salt and fresh water to live, that disappears. So they have to go elsewhere, either further upriver or somewhere else to another river. So the only part left really of the Savannah River that is relatively in good shape is the middle third. And the river keeper there, another of my heroes in the book, are the river keepers and all the good work that they do, So Tanya there she concentrates on that middle third, and boy, does she fight some fights, and she is roundly pilloried. She is just excoriated for doing the right thing to try and save the river. She is now, the big issue there is there's a dam that everybody wants destroyed so that the fish can go further upstream and everything. But there are about 5 or 6 landowners who have very nice houses along the river that say, if you remove that dam, then the water level is going to drop 2 feet and I'm going to have to look at a ring of mud. So, it's that sort of fight that she fights. But she's also, and this is something more common, I think, up north and out west, she is beginning to rewild the lower part of the river above Savannah. And by rewilding, that river was so bastardized, so changed over the years that, when they wanted to get the cotton in the market, well, the Corps of Engineers and others said the best way to do that is a straight line. When you straight line a river, when you take out all the bends and all of the curves in that, it also ruins the river because it goes faster, the sediment change is different. So what they are now doing, armed with a lot of money from the federal government due to the deepening process, they had to do a lot of environmental mitigations. They're rewilding a stretch of the river. They're putting the curves back in it, so that'll be more naturally flowing and hopefully a healthier river.
So that was one of the sort of optimistic stories that you shared. Or was there more that, some of it, the statistics, your father-in-law's not totally wrong. It is a bit of a downer. But what gave you optimism?
Well, it's the people, really. People like Chris. I'm not just saying that, but the people in my book are the heroes, the river keepers, the biologists, the ecologists. One of the things that when I think of this, and climate change is just such a downer. It's hard to think of anything good about climate change, except for the bill that was just signed by the president a couple of weeks ago, which is actually very good. But especially here in the Deep South, climate change is something of a 4-letter word. Largely conservative politicians and government officials calling the shots really don't either want to think about it or want to do anything about climate change. So that could be extremely depressing. But that said, and I have this in the book on on Tybee in particular, there are a lot of elected officials, Republicans, most of them, city managers, county managers, planning folks who take climate change very seriously. Sea level rise, of course, is a huge issue along the coast. More frequent and stronger hurricanes and storms are a big issue down there. And so what I found was interesting is that when you talk to these people, they'll say, and they're lying here, I don't know what causes climate change. Well, they do, of course they do, but politically they can't say what causes climate change. But they go, I would be remiss and derelict in my duty if I were to ignore the effects of climate change. For example, the former city manager in the town of St. Mary's, Georgia, he's about as rock rib Republican as you can get. I tried to say, hey, what's causing climate change? Say, I don't know. And they go, well, what are you doing about it? And he goes, just as I said, I am doing something about it. Our city building code now requires that homes are built 3 feet higher. We are insulating our electric stations from sea level rise. We are putting in reverse valves so that when the flooding rises up, it won't be able to get into town. So he's doing things, and he's doing things not because he really thinks that climate change is all that. He's doing things because if he doesn't, he's going to be out of a job because his town will be ruined. So there are things like that where people are starting to realize that this is an issue, and regardless of politics, we have to deal with it.
So then you covered Hurricane Michael, and that hurricane affected a tree in the panhandle of Florida called the Toria tree, which is, I think, the second chapter in my book. And I got out in the field with Atlanta Botanical Garden, who is really trying to work on finding out. It's got a fungus. It's got a problem that if you transplant the tree, you take the fungus with it. Right. So the possibility of migrating that tree to other places, some people have done it, but it's problematic. So let's talk about Florida. What a mess! What a mess! The highway that got postponed. There were signs all over when we were traveling through Florida. Donna Campbell is here, the photographer for the book, and they were
say no to
the Suncoast connector. Florida is such a mess, and of course Muir ended up at Cedar Key, a very beautiful place at one time.
I'm probably like you. I have this love-hate relationship with Florida. I mean, we vacation there every year. I go there a lot for work. The biodiversity is off the charts. Beautiful beaches, really cool ranchlands in the middle. The panhandle's lovely. But they're ruining it. And the people in power really don't seem to care.
An aquifer underneath the ground. I just sort of learned about that. I mean, as a kid, I went to Florida all the time from Atlanta, where I grew up. But that aquifer is amazing. How much water runs under.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, Florida welcomes, if that's the word, 900 newcomers every day. Okay. If you think of that, that's, my math isn't very good, but that's 300,000 people a year. And all of the natural resources, whether they're getting hammered by climate change, which they are along the coast, say goodbye to the beloved Keys, but also in the north, the panhandle, but also more towards the central part of the north, there is that aquifer which runs really from Charleston down to Miami and then over to Mississippi, I think. It's the Floridan aquifer. And it was once thought to be an irrepressible amount of water, never would run dry, right? Well, it's starting to go down precipitously. And that's because we are sticking, for lack of a better analogy, so many straws into it. We're sucking so much water out of the aquifer, which is largely the drinking water for everybody along the east coast of South Carolina or Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, and back into the hinterlands, that in times of drought, it gets perilously close to running dry. In further problems that it has, especially along where the Suwannee River is, if y'all know where that is, heading out into the Gulf from the Okefenokee. And that whole sort of northern farming region there has lovely, beautiful, crystal clear blue springs. There's hundreds of them. There's the state parks that are named after springs in there. They're fun to swim in. They're beautiful. They connect to the aquifer. So as the aquifer not only gets pulled out for watering lettuce or orange groves or to sate Jacksonville's insatiable water demands, but then you have not only that harms it, but then you have all of the farming, and you have the septic tanks, and you have the sewage systems that kick into it. So a beautiful river like the Suwannee and some of the other ones are just being sort of killed, by death by 1,000 cuts. And it's another sort of sad, only in Florida can we do this and get away with it. But, I love Florida, but I hate Florida.
So Muir got to Cedar Key, and what happened?
Well, he was one of the Muir's epiphany of really environmental thinking happened in Bonaventure Cemetery, which, if y'all know, that's in Savannah. And it's a beautiful, lovely old cemetery. And I start my book, the introduction.
Johnny Mercer's buried there.
Johnny Mercer's buried there, and there's other famous people too. I can't.
Yeah.
There's the crying girl.
Conrad
Yeah.
Aiken.
Conrad Aiken.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
But anyway, so he spent 6 days there. When he walked, he had walked from Kentucky through Tennessee, corner of Carolina, a lot of Georgia, and ended up in Savannah. 1867, and the Reconstruction was still pretty strong, poverty everywhere.
So this was astonishing to me. He walked 700 miles in 38 days.
Right, to get to Savannah. He was broke. He was exhausted. He was waiting for his brother to wire him money so he could finish his trek, and it never came. So he couldn't afford a hotel. He had to sleep outside. He slept outside most of the time. But in Savannah, the only place he could really find to sleep outside was in the cemetery, Bonaventure Cemetery. So he spent 5 days there. And during that time, I think it was probably where the onset of malaria happened.
Really?
Yeah, because he was just kind of out of it, thinking crazy thoughts. But those crazy thoughts really became sort of his bedrock philosophy of environmentalism, man's relationship to nature, and how man and animals need green space. Really is sort of the basic tenets of his philosophy. And just briefly, the main thing as it relates to man's relationship to nature, remember, he was a very religious dude. His father was a very strict sort of traveling itinerant preacher who came from Scotland. So John had a lot of baggage with him when he wrestled with the idea of, well, wait a minute, I have been taught my whole life that the creatures of the world are there for man's benefit. That deer over there, that's my meat. That bear over there, that's my jacket. So all of these things were placed on earth for man. Well, John got to thinking like, no, that's not really true now, is it? And so he said, and this was sort of the beginning of his philosophy along those things, that, every creature, and quote, every transmicroscopic creature on the planet has a role to play. And we should honor that and accept that and be part of that. We are no greater than, say, an ant or a deer or a bird. We all have a role to play. He was still very religious in God's green earth. But who are we, Lord Man, as he called us, to flaunt our superior strength and intellect, supposedly, over other creatures? So that was really one of the main things he came to realize in Bonaventure, as well as all creatures, large and small, including man, need nature. We all need to get out there for our spiritual, our moral, our ethical, our physical health. And so those were some of the two main ideas that really crystallized for him in Bonaventure Cemetery as he was struggling with hunger and probably malaria. The package finally came with $150 in it, and he was overjoyed, obviously. He went out and bought some gingerbread, ate a big thing of gingerbread, hopped on a boat. So he did not walk the whole way. Hopped on a boat, went to now Fernandina Beach, and then continued his trek on down across Florida, following a railroad track because it was all trees, to Cedar Key, where he officially had malaria and got very, very sick and almost died.
And he had planned to go to South America. He was going to keep going, right?
That was his whole thing. I mean, he fashioned himself an explorer and botanist along the lines of some of the great German von, blah, 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 you know him, von, I'm spacing, explorers who had done the Amazon and collected plants along the way. So he said, I'm going to do that. I'm going to walk through the South, get on a boat, go down to the Amazon, walk to the Amazon, pick up all the plants I can, and I'll be famous. Well, he never made it, because, at least not for another 30 or 40 years, because he got deathly sick, had to be nursed back to health in Cedar Key, which is a lovely little town along the Gulf, for 3 months. And then finally he was strong enough that he could continue his journey to Cuba. And then he realized he was not going to be able to get a boat because he was still sort of sick, down to South America. So via New York, he went to California, and the rest, as they say, is history. Right.
So he would meet Emerson, and he would meet Teddy Roosevelt, and became actually such a popular figure that he gained wealth and spent a lot of time lecturing and was
writing,
a
wrote a lot of books and became very famous and wealthy, hobnobbing with the bigwigs, but using that to lobby, for whether it was Yosemite or other national parks or just nature in general, and why we need these to preserve these spaces.
So I want to ask you one thing about your writing per se, and that is, you have an interesting way of being circuitous, or taking us on a circle in the chapters. You kind of get to the end, and then you circle back and tell us more. How did you develop that? It's not a sequential chapter. It sort of moves around back and forth. Where'd you come up with that? And is that something you always do, or did somebody teach you that?
No, I mean, this was because the book is chronological. You know, I mean, the book was laid out, Muir's book was laid out to me. You start here, you end up here, A to B. So that's the route you follow. That's made it kind of easy. But it would have been, I think, kind of boring if I, in every chapter, had followed his every footstep and then interjected my own thoughts and color and research. So it was hard, though, in that, you know, it would have been easy just to do it completely chronologically in every chapter, too. But, you know, after a while, that would have been, okay, chapter 12, here we are. We're starting with Muir. It goes from here to there.
So when you're drafting these chapters, you're doing that circular thing?
I mean,
you do that as a habit?
No, it's hard to explain. I mean, it's kind of like, what is the material, right? In this chapter, I think I've got really good material. But maybe I start off this chapter with Muir because he's got really good material. Or maybe I start off with a botanist who's doing incredible things. And so then I go from there. I just want, in every chapter, I had sort of, you know, 3 or 4 goals. You know, of course, have a little bit of Muir in there. Each chapter has to have a topic, an issue. And then also I want to write about the beauty, the biodiversity, travelogue, what have you, and, you know, describe the beauty and what I'm seeing along the way too. So there's like 3 different things that I had to get done in every chapter. How I got them done, there was no formula.
Really? Well, it's interesting because it is sort of jumps around all over the place, and I hang with you. Good. I really liked it.
Thank you.
But it's not a style. Do you use that style in your newspaper work? Did you?
No, I mean, you know, newspapers, they're all pretty much regimented. You can do that more obviously in magazine stuff and more easily in books because you have the liberty, you have the leeway to just go. And, you know, like I am, as you could probably tell, rather verbose, not only in person, but also on the page, which is why editors, if mine is listening, hello, Aaron, reel me in, you know, and say, okay, you're going off on a tangent. You got to, you know, cut 1,000 words out of this chapter. You're honing in, you know, be precise, all of that stuff.
I wanted to ask you about the editing process and Island Press, but talk about how close did you come on the first draft? How many drafts of this did you do?
I'm the kind of writer who has to have the beginning of a chapter or the beginning of a story. Nothing can flow until, and it's a bad habit to have for all you aspiring writers out there, because you need to, especially if you're on deadline, you got to get it all in there. But I am in the luxury of writing a book or a feature piece or a magazine piece is you can take the time And, but I need to have that perfect first paragraph, anecdote, half page, what have you.
Me too, even if I get rid of it.
Exactly. But at least I can't flow until I have that, and then I'll go back and jettison it maybe, or, I'll extensively rewrite, but I extensively rewrite everything. But that's just some kind of anal that way that I.
But I mean, the book has 2022 in it.
Mm-hmm.
So that I thought, usually there's like a year.
No, you're right.
So what?
Well, it had largely been finished about a year before it was published. But then, there's the whole editing, and then there's the whole copy editing and all that. So you're right. So at the end of the copy, like for the example, the road issue in Florida, they were trying to build three. That still makes me mad to think about it. 3 toll roads from the central to the north, due north pretty of Florida. And if you all know the Big Bend area of Florida, it's still where Cedar Key is and all that. It's still largely undeveloped, and largely because, unlike the rest of Florida, it's very shallow off the coast there. So no developer can go in there and put in a marina, which is great because that means, they're going to leave it alone. And, especially where the Suwannee comes out, up around over to Apalachicola and down that whole curve. It's just some of the prettiest, I think, part of Florida. So they were going to put 3 roads in through there, and they all got killed the first year. And I said in there, I think my first draft, but don't worry, this is Florida. Bad ideas will always, come back. And sure enough, they did. They only had 1, and I did not get to include. I did get to include that they defeated the first round, but I didn't get to include what happened when they tried to put the other road in there, which thankfully 2 weeks ago they killed that one too. But this being Florida, were bad ideas.
Well, so writing a book during COVID too was sort of a tricky thing, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it actually, and I feel somewhat guilty saying this, it afforded me the opportunity because I love to camp. I backpacked the Smokies, Nantahala, Pisgah, Jefferson Highlands, all of the forests through here. I've done them all. And so I have all the equipment. And so I would just get in my trusty little Subaru and visit all these places. I had been to obviously many of them before, but I would go there and I would report during the day. And if I had to talk to somebody, I would usually wear a mask. And they would wear a mask. And then I wouldn't go to a hotel. I wouldn't go out to restaurants. I would take my food with me in my tent, and my sleeping bag, and just go back to wherever I was camping and, camp. But it was also good because, everybody was going stir crazy, right? And I, thankfully, and thank you, Sammy, was allowed to go out and, do this in the midst of, the pandemic. So
yeah,
it kind of worked.
And that sort of changed everything. We're still unpacking how it changed things.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, I don't, I hope we don't go through this again, but I think again, maybe I'm more Pollyannish now than I was when I was writing the book. I think it gave all of us and the country a greater appreciation for what's out there, for the forests, for the rivers, for the valleys or whatnot. I mean, when you're faced with this unknown killer disease, which is forcing your house, if you get to go outside and experience nature, well, I mean, that's, what's better than that? So I'm hoping that sort of carries over into, everybody's everyday life and policymaking too.
So what's next?
I'm driving back to Atlanta tonight.
No. Do you have another book in mind?
I've got ideas. I don't have anything anything imminent. I've got some good ideas, I think, but it's going to take a lot more fleshing out and thinking. The thing with this is that, again, I was searching for something and I knew I wanted to do something. And when I saw that Muir had written and walked this thing, the light bulb, that was my epiphany. I haven't had that, for anything else I'm working on yet.
How about Island Press? I wasn't really familiar. They're a nonprofit. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of like working with a university press, maybe?
Yeah, it is. And they're great. They were very, I kind of just sort of cold called them. I didn't have an agent. And I said, hey, might y'all be interested in this? And they're like, sure, send me, whatever. And then my editor, Erin, she said, I kind of like this. And so we just went from there. And they were great to work with because, their whole focus is books about the environment and sustainability. So they got it. I think I was a little bit of a round peg in a square hole because I'm not writing about, how to make cities more livable or, more sustainability type stuff. Mine is more kind of like a travelogue, and it's a Southern travelogue, but it's got John Muir in it. So it's weird. And thankfully they saw what I saw in it, because it's not, really sort of typical, I think.
Great. So do we have any questions? Is it too soon, Stephanie?
It's not. I think it's perfect timing. We do have one from the at-home audience. But I'm happy to start with the folks here in the store first. If anyone wants to shoot up their hand. Or I'll ask the at-home question, and y'all can just think about that. So Aaron, your editor,
Hi, Aaron.
says hi. And asks Dan, do you feel differently about the South's prospects after writing this book?
Oh, of course, I expect a good question like that from you. I am, even though, again, I write about some pretty nasty, depressing stuff, I think, more encouraged because, and it may sound corny and cliched, of the people who are doing the work. And really, they are unsung heroes. And I see it, with Virginia. What is she, 14 years old? And that's just amazing, to me, that somebody could be so committed and so mad and angry. And like, you older people, me, have really screwed things up for us. And so we got to fix it. So I am along those lines, and I am along the lines sort of on a more global scale, in that I think more and more people are getting it. I think more and more people are appreciating, whether it's, because of due to the pandemic, I think more and more people are appreciating what we have, and they don't want to see it lost. I may be wrong on that. It's kind of really hard to gauge sort of commitment to things environmental. One of the, again, empirical ways that I gauge it is to look at polling on climate change. And the Yale University does great stuff on that. And every year, more and more people, regular people, are saying, yes, it's an issue. Yes, we need to do something about it. And I'm willing to do something about it. So the numbers now are about, and it cuts across regions, believe it or not. And you take the South, it would be, unlike the Northwest. But no, I mean, you get similarly 65, 70% of respondents will say, yeah, this is an issue, we got to deal with it. So things like that give me hope. And, recent legislation that passed, that's a big deal. So things like that do give me hope. And I will, I'll take that for as much as I can get.
So Jim, would you like to weigh in on that? Because you spent a lot of time, traveling around the South.
Mm-hmm. Well, I talk about plant blindness in my book, which is a theory or a condition that was named by a couple of botanists from the South who say that a lot of people these days, especially young people who don't spend time outdoors, who don't get out in the woods, who spend a lot of time in front of screens, can't distinguish one plant from another. They see, in fact, if they go out, they focus on animals, the moving things, and that the rest of the world is just a blurry green backdrop. And so I talk a lot about my own experience growing up with a grandmother who knew the names of plants in Latin and the common name, who was a gardener. We'd go to nurseries around Atlanta on weekends until I was bored out of my mind. But I learned a lot from my grandparents and my parents who loved plants. And we always went on natural vacations. Obviously, you've done that with your boys. It is incumbent upon us as the grown-ups to make sure that children value the outdoors, understand nature, and have experiences in it. And so that's a big topic for me. I also try to appeal to the aspects of our Southern culture, like who we are and how we identify, has to do with our natural environment, which is so glorious. And even if people spend a lot of money making a natural environment. They buy plants. Let's buy native plants. Let's all do a little bit. I'm working on the next book is about places, destinations in the 7 states of the South that you can go and take your kids and have them experience some of the incredible magic of nature. And I hope that we will begin, you can just go to a botanical garden or an arboretum or whatever, but getting out and seeing the synchronized lightning bugs, which have become suddenly very popular.
Right.
I think people are focusing more on these natural events because they can get outside and be safer than indoors as we still lingering pandemic. But I do try to give that message wherever I'm talking about the book that as Southerners, we can't take for granted the glories of our environment.
And along those lines, you're exactly right. Another thing that I think, when I tell people this, they're just like amazed. In the South, most of the land is privately held, okay? Not publicly held. In Georgia, only 3% of the land is in public hands, and that includes military bases, okay? In North Carolina, it's a little bit higher, but Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, literally about 3% of the land is only in public hands. And that includes, the Nantahala, the Pisgah, Cherokee, all of those forests. So my point is that since so little land is in public hands, the conservation crowd, have no choice but to work with private industry. All most of it is pine tree plantations as far as the eye can see. We cannot do conservation. We cannot do endangered species survival without working with private industry. And they now, not all of them, of course, but there's a greater understanding there. And there are laws on the books that further, act as a cudgel to get them to work on conservation. And an example, one of the ones I use in my book and I really like is there's a water sewer utility in Beaufort, South Carolina, which put in a few $1 million to buy land up 100 miles above where they have their intake valves. Why would they, that's a lot of money. How do you get that past your shareholders? How do you get that past your CEO? Because they know that if the water in this farm, where the spring and where the creek is that flows into the Savannah, if that land is protected and clean, the water that flows into the Savannah is in better shape. The water that comes down the Savannah to their intake is in better shape. They'll have to use fewer chemicals to clean the water. So it's that sort of smart thinking.
And didn't they get toilets that did I read that in your book?
What?
About lower water use toilets in Beaufort?
Well, I mean, a lot of, like Atlanta, they
people to
low flow toilets. Atlanta, for all of its warts, during all of the water wars with Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, they said, of course, they had the Supreme Court weighing over their heads. If you don't do things, you're going to lose access to the river. They have reduced water consumption in Metro Atlanta by 10%, which is something. It's not nothing. But there are many of those sorts of things. And again, I tend to look at, I try to look at conservation. I have to look at conservation through sort of a business perspective, because I think if you just look at it through an environmental perspective, you ain't going to get nothing done. So, you go where the money is. It doesn't matter if it's the environment. Every story is about money, pretty much, right? So you've got to deal with the people who have the money. And if you can convince them either out of altruism or out of the weight of federal law and state law, but usually federal law, they more times than not will do the right thing. So that's something I think another sort of point I make in the book is that you got to you can't say you're the boogeyman all the time. You got to bring them to the table.
Well, and Georgia, in my experience, is ahead of a lot of other states in terms of building collaborations with industry and government. And the plant folks out of the state botanical garden are doing a great job, and they're a model for other states.
Okay.
So they're building alliances.
Anything else? Anybody have any questions?
I have a question. So as you sort of recreated this historic journey that you took, obviously had background in the subject matter, but you went deeper for your book. What surprised you the most?
Oh, good question. What surprised me? I told you one of the thing about how you get really conservative people who have to deal with climate change. That was a surprise. I did not expect that. You know, even as a reporter, I rarely came across the powers that be who took climate change seriously, let alone, you know, Republicans. So that was surprising. I was surprised at the level of devastation of coal ash. And I'd covered a lot of that as a reporter, but then when I went up to Kingston, Tennessee, you know, the local paper, the paper out of Knoxville had done really good work on that, Pulitzer-worthy work on that practically. And their accounting is 50 people have died from just cleaning up the coal ash spill at Kingston. They've attributed 50 deaths to, you know, the toxicity of the ash that they were having to clean up and breathe. And that was shocking, I thought too. I'm sure there are more, but you know, there's things that really jump. I guess it's always the bad that kind of jumps out at me. But yeah, those are a couple examples, I think.
Well, we're at the top of the hour, so thank you both so much, and let's do